Again, today is the 28th, and we're going to be going over right now Chapter 2 in our text that starts on page 73. All right, as you can see, it's called Working with Functions, Data Types, and Operators. What we're going to do after we get done with the lecture is what you have is the beginning of 2 copies of a calculator. All right, the first one that we put in there will be just bare bones. It'll be almost nothing in it whatsoever. Plus, the only thing you can do is add right now when we start. Then we're going to go and in the Chapter 2 version, which you also have the framework for, we're going to add functions to it. We'll look at the data types and we'll look at operators. Then again, as we go through each chapter in here, we'll add some of that information from those chapters. Right now, this is no joke, the interface will be butt ugly. All that's going to be on it is a button. That's it. I don't care. We will eventually add to it and we'll bring it in. So right now it's running almost distinct or disjoint from HTML. Plus there's absolutely no CSS in it. I've got a CSS file in it that's basically empty. All right. So as far as what we're trying to do today, again, use functions. Typically, the reason that you use functions, as they mentioned here, is to organize your code. The other word that you will hear, I think everybody else has it, Joe. Everybody has the copy now, right? Has copied the, okay, thank you. You'll hear the term modularizing your code, all right? My daughter called me the other day from Rockton, Illinois, and she's got a degree, which I asked her not to get because I told her it wouldn't do her any good. They've got a degree there that's called technical studies, which means you can take a bunch of classes that you really think are cool, and then you get a degree. Of course, it makes you actually prepared to do absolutely nothing, all right? So she's going back again, and she's decides she wants to be in the film industry. You know, stranger things have happened. So she's going and she's getting a certificate. Well, she's got to write a paper. And she mentioned that the professor there wants her to write a paper and they have to do an outline. An outline is kind of modularization. You're starting with very, specific, very general stuff and you're going more and more specific. So if you've got Roman numerals, they're very general. And then you've got A, B, C underneath there that are more specific. And then maybe under A, you've got 1, 2, 3, which is even more specific. That's kind of what functions do. So in the first program that we look at, that you've got the framework for, there'll just be one function in it, and that's main. All right? What we're already going to do by the second program is what you'll notice that main's going to do is it's going to just call 3 or 4 other functions. That's all it's going to do. And ideally, that's what main does. It's called a driver. Now, there is nothing special in JavaScript about the word main. The reason I'm using the word main is next semester when you're in C#, the following semester when you're in ASP.NET, and the semester after that when you're in Java, all of them require when you write an application to have a function or method in it called main. So why not just get used to using the word right now? All right, so that's what I used. All right, we'll talk about expressions and operators. You know what a lot of this stuff is already. Your major operators, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. All right, I know that. The one that you may or may not be aware of is something that's called modulo. So if I divide 13 by 2, you get 6.5. No, if I divide 13 by 2, how many times does 6 even, I'm going to give you the answer. How many times does 2 evenly go into 13? 6, right? And the remainder is 1. The modulo operator gives you the remainder. All right, so we'll take a look at that. And then identify the order of precedence in an expression. You probably learned that. It might have been grade school. It might have been junior high. When your teacher told you do multiplication and division before you do addition and subtraction. And if you want to change the order, you use parentheses. It doesn't change. The stuff that you learned here you learn in this chapter for expressions, operators, order of precedence. It's the same regardless of whatever programming language you're using. All right? That's a good thing. So what they're saying is so far, basically, we put everything into just one unit or one function. But in JavaScript, you can have more than one functions. You can have as many functions as you want or need to have. All right. Now, sometimes people get confused because say, well, what's a function? What's a method? Okay. If you're working with object-oriented programming, and we're not going to until Chapter 7, but when you work in object-oriented programming, any function that you create in an object is called a method. If it's not object-oriented programming, then it's called a function. All right? It's just a unit of code that's designed to do one thing. So if you can imagine, I might have even given you something like this before, but if you can imagine that I ask you for 10 pieces of information, or the first time that you come in here, let's say it was the first day of class, and I ask for your first name, your middle initial, your last name, your address, your city, your state, your zip, your home phone, your cell phone. Maybe you don't have a home phone, but that's fine. And something else. So 10 pieces of information. Most people are going to say, well, you're going to pull out a piece of paper and you're going to write down those 10 pieces of information. That makes sense. That's how most people program. They would write one function that would ask for all 10 pieces of information. But in a truly modular type of program, that would be 10 different functions. It would be like I gave you a different piece of paper to write each thing on. All right? And the reason that you do that is, let's suppose that one of the things I ask you to do is a calculation, some kind of a calculation. If you have everything in one big routine that's hundreds of lines long, and these routines can get big really fast, and now you've got a problem with that calculation, it might be hard to dig out and find exactly where the problem is. But if you take and you put that calculation in its own function, and it's a small function, and you have a problem, now you know right where to look. All right? So really, when you work with languages, the way that most programming languages work today is, it used to be that you'd have a 500-word or 500-line program, and you might have a couple functions in the whole thing. So they'd average 250 lines each. That's very hard to debug a program like that. Today, you're more than likely, if you have a 500-line program, you might have 50 functions in it. And each function will be 10 lines approximately each. But it's easier to debug the program that way. That's why you create functions. So really what functions are supposed to be is they're supposed to be code, related code, that performs a single task. That might not be the exact definition your author gives, but that's what they're supposed to be. All right? Now, there's two different kinds of functions in JavaScript. And most languages, not all, but most languages provide two types like this. The one that you're going to like the most, because it's the easiest to use, it's the one we're going to start with, is what are called name functions. That means, all kidding aside, the function has a name. All right? And that when you want to reference that function, you do what's called call the function. Okay? The other type of function that you can create is what's called an anonymous function. They're designed to be called just one time. All right? So you don't even have to give them a name. They're a little bit harder to work with syntactically, but they make sense once you start taking a look at them. And it's really very important that you understand both, because if your goal is to go out and to become a web designer, all right, and a web developer, you're going to work with anonymous functions. That's what jQuery is, which is a JavaScript library. It's just tons of anonymous functions. All right, that's what the whole library is made up of. Okay, so as it says, they're both times they're a set of related statements, but whereas a name function has a name, an anonymous function does not have a name. All right, here's the syntax that you have to use. So you say function, and if it's a name function, you give it the name. Then inside of parentheses, any parameters. And I've given this example before. It's kind of a stupid example, but you'll probably, maybe it'll make more sense. That parameters are information that the function needs in order to do its job. So if I wanted to add two numbers in a function, I'd have to provide for that function the two numbers to add. Make sense? I used to tell people, it's like, let's say that I go home and my daughter's room is a pigsty. She comes home from school, and I say, go clean the room. I don't say clean your room. I'm just so upset. I say clean the room. So her, in her typical smart-ass way, will say, well, what room, Dad? All right, type of an idea. And I say, your bedroom. That would be the parameter. So it's the information that the function needs in order to do its job. Sometimes it needs no information whatsoever. All right, so you just put an empty set of parentheses in there. Sometimes it needs one thing, sometimes it might need many things. Again, I go back to the example I gave you before. If the idea is that I want to give you the sum of two numbers, then you better give me the two numbers. All right, that would be the parameters. Now, on the other hand, again, notice that when you do an anonymous function, it looks different because there's no name. And you'll see that a little bit later on in the chapter here. And remember, if it doesn't totally make sense, we're not going to start with anonymous functions. We'll work our way into that a lot later. All right? So if I created a function that was called calculate square root, and it required some number that I had to pass in to calculate the square root, this is how I would invoke it. Oops. And that's called a function call, sometimes a function invocation, but function call is the one you'll see most often. So it's the name of the function, calculate square root, and the parameter is number. That makes sense? That parameter that you put in there, the thing that whatever you put into the parentheses, whether it's zero things, one thing, or more things, those are called actual parameters. All right, that's the way they're referred to. And the reason I'm telling you that is later you're going to see something when we show it in the function, then it's called a formal parameter. So there is a distinction between those. All right. So here we're just calling it, and we're passing it one thing. Here we're calling calculate volume, and volume needs three things. Okay? Again, functions do not have to contain parameters. So here would be an example. What I want to show you, because the author doesn't. All right, the author, again, is teaching you how to swim by taking your foot and sticking it into the wading pool. All right, he's not pushing you in. Okay, so right here, notice we're calling, this is a function call or a function invocation. We're passing the function three things. Everybody sees that. These are the actual parameters. They're called length, they're called width, and they're called height. All right, here's the function itself. What I want you to understand is these, since they're inside of the function declaration, these are called formal parameters. They don't have to be the same name. All right? So, you might say, well, what length, height, length, width, height. Length, width, height. Shouldn't they be the same name? You can make them the same name, but they don't have to be. If I wanted to, I could have called this L, W, and H. And then I would have said var volume equals L times W times H. Does that make sense? All right? Because it might be confusing right now. Well, why would you ever name them anything differently? What if I create a very simple function on my own? I know it's going to be a little hard to see, but I type in here function, and I call it add2. It's just going to add two numbers, and I'll call them N1 and N2. And all I want to do in there is return N1 plus N2. Well, you're all smart enough to realize I could call this in my program, so I could call add2, and I could pass 15 and 25. Then I could call it a little later on my program, add2, and I could pass it 20 and 80, for example. Those are two different calls, and maybe they wouldn't be actual numbers, maybe they'd be variables, A, B, and C, D, or something like that. But the idea is, by not making this have to have the same name, all right, now I can call it here and I can call it here. I could have called it here AB, or I could have called it CD. That might have been confusing. All right. Besides that, sometimes when programmers write really good code, they make their actual parameters words that are very descriptive, like length, width, etc. And sometimes they're very long. And if you're working in your own function, you might not want to keep typing in those long words. All right. All right. They talk about indentation in here, and it's important that you realize indentation does absolutely nothing for a program. What the compiler does and the interpreter, when they grab your code, and the idea is to try to turn your code into the zeros and ones the computer can understand, the first thing it does is it gets rid of all white space. So you put white space in there so it's easier for you to read. That's it. That's the only reason. Okay? All right, this is what you work on in the chapter. I'm going to turn up a little bit. If you have your book with you, please turn to page 82. I'm going to go back in just a second, but I'm going to go ahead right now to page 82. And if you don't have your book with you, fine, but please write this down. Tiffany found this out yesterday. There is an error right here in your book, and her program was fine, the one that she did from the chapter here, but it didn't work. Because that word right there that says document, that should say window. And if you leave it as document, it does not work. So make sure you change that to the word window. All right, everybody see that right here? Make this window. I can't. No, go ahead.
Why did this test in like my sentence show up? So is it just for this exercise thing that we can change that, or is it all?
No, when we go on, I'll let you know. All right. But I know that that's wrong in the one that you build for the chapter. All right. You may or may not know this, but most authors, when they write books, and I did not look for this author, but they have something that's called errata, E-R-R-A-T-A, and that's when they find errors that are in the book. All right, they go and publish them online. There used to be, this is no joke, there was a publisher that I knew of. What they did was they started offering $10 to the first person who would find, an error. Now, if I found an error, if you spelled the word wrong, then Amin couldn't send in the same thing if I were to already give him $10 for it. But the idea is they were finding out how bad their authors were. No joke. They were putting up thousands of dollars for their books because people were able to find all sorts of weird errors, grammatical errors and other things. So most places don't do that. All right. This is what you build in the chapter. All right. You're given much of you're just going to have to put the JavaScript in. But the idea is it's this fan trick, fine art photography. And if you leave that as document, when you put the values in here, this doesn't change. You don't get anything in here. But if you change it from document to window, then you'll get the number. That's all I did on yours. Okay? All right. I'm not going to go through any of the exercise because that's what you're doing in this chapter. Besides that, it would take this lecture and make it really, really, really long. Again, by now, I want you to start developing a comfort level with this. Get element by ID. Okay? That means that somewhere in the HTML, somebody has defined something that's got an ID of photogenum, or photognum, I guess. All right? But they explain in here, and I think, Evan picked this book out. I think he's done a really good job of picking books. I really do. All right. I don't mind any of the ones that I've looked at so far. Okay. All right. Again, when you invoke a function, it's known as a function call. Okay. Now, I think I'll write it like this. This is the kind of thing that we're going to look at. So again, if it doesn't totally make sense right now, please don't let it bother you. So let's say that I come in here and I type in function main. Is that big enough that everybody can see it okay? Okay. And I come in here and I say var num1 equal 10. Var num2 equal 15. Now I want to come in here and say var answer. All right. And I want it to say equal num1 plus num2. And that's okay to do that. The problem is, the more I write, the bigger this routine gets, and it'll eventually get really, really, really big. All right? So what I want to do is I want to add those two numbers up. And I want to show you this because to me this is really important. So I'm going to first do this. I'm just going to say, I'm going to call this function. It's going to be called add2, and I'm going to pass it num1, and I'm going to pass it num2. I'm not going to worry about printing anything. None of that stuff matters right now. So function add2, and I'm just going to say here n1, n2, var sum equals n1 plus n2. Okay, and that's fine. So I could come in here if I wanted to, and I could come in alert. The answer is plus sum. Does this make sense to people that if I did this, it would print out on the screen? The answer is 25. Does that make sense to everyone? All right, I'm purposely taking something that's really, really simple because I don't want to overwhelm you with this stuff because it's quite easy to do. All right? Now, what if I don't want that alert? I want that alert, but I don't want that alert to be down there. I want that alert to print up in main. Do you understand what I'm saying? I don't want to do an alert in here. I want to do an alert up here. Then what I can do is I can create my other variable and I can say var ans for answer equals this. But now I'm going to grab that alert. So just for right now, just let me grab this and I'm going to paste it in here. You'll see what I'm doing hopefully in just a minute. So I'm going to remove this. But now if I say var sum equal n1 plus n2, it's just sitting there. So I don't even have to create a variable here. I can just say this, return. Because what that does now is it comes in, creates a variable, calls this function. This function just says, okay, I passed in n1, which was 10, I passed in n2, which was 15, add those two up and return it, but now stuff it into that variable. Does that make sense? And then when I say the answer is, of course I wouldn't say sum here, I would say ans. So I would get the exact same output. All right, I would get the exact same output. The only difference is that here I'd be doing it inside of main. So if I wanted to, I could even do this. Print result. And I have to pass in, let's say we'll pass in num1, num2, and ans. All right. Now I come down here and I say function, print result. And I'm going to put in here, tell you what I'm going to do because this is going to go off the screen. So I don't like doing this, but I'm going to do that anyway. And I'm going to say here n1, n2, and r for result. Document, yeah, we could write it right to the document.write. We could do an alert. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to say n1, this is going to look really ugly, plus n2 plus equals plus a, and that would be an r. Now, I don't expect that to make a lot of sense to you, but what I want you to understand is this. And that's why it's good that it's on here like this. What the system does is it makes a copy of what's in that variable, all right? And that's what goes into here. It makes a copy of that variable, and that's what goes into here. So actually, when it calls this, what it really does is it does that. Does that make sense? That's exactly the way it works in any programming language. Anything. Now, there's more to it in some languages, but in this language, that's it. All right? Since we're passing copies, that's why we can name it something different if we want to. I could have called them num1 and num2 in here. That would have been fine. But again, these two things right here, those are called actual parameters. These two things right here, those are called formal parameters. And again, in any language, it doesn't matter, all right? So here, we have to return something because we're stuffing it into a variable. So we're returning n1 plus n2, so that we add those two and we return that 25, that goes in there. Then when we call this, again, we're passing what? 10, 15, and now 25. But in here, our formal parameters, we're calling them n1, n2, and r. And if that makes even a little sense to you, then you're on your way to understanding this. And if you say it makes absolutely no sense to me, then keep listening. I'll take your question in a second, and you're going to have to read the chapter. All right, you know, I went through, pardon my French, but I went through the same crap when I was a student, when the teacher would say, you got to read this. But typically she or he was right. For it to make sense, you have to read it. The first time, I'm not kidding you, I don't know if I ever told you this, this is not a joke. The first time I ever took a programming class where the teacher didn't help us, basically say, type in this, then type in this, then type in this, and I was given my first programming example, or my first programming assignment, I went to the library and started hyperventilating, literally. I mean, and all these people were like, this is really simple. I was taking it at a different college because it was during the summer. And I thought, I'm never going to get this. All right. I mean, literally, no joke. Back then, I didn't have much money, not that I do now. But if somebody had said, I'll bet you all the money you have that you're going to become a teacher and you're going to teach us stuff someday, I would take it. I would have bet everything I would ever make that I would never do that. All right, you can all get this. Yes?
So the R in the print result function, is that referencing like the return?
That's
or
the
is that
answer.
just the answer?
That's it.
And that's just a formal parameter for
Yes.
that? Okay. Gotcha.
All right. Anything else? Is there anything in here that really looks out in left field that doesn't make any sense whatsoever? Okay, that's a good question. Okay, so think about play computer here. That's going to write 10, correct? This is going to write 15, and this is going to write 25. Everybody agree with those? This says literally put in a blank space and a plus sign. This says put in a blank space and a plus sign and another blank space. And this says put in a blank space and an equal sign. So that's going to say 10 plus 15 equals 25. So that right there, that's plus sign, is what we're getting with this. This equal sign is what we're getting with this. All right, yes?
How come for reference, like, at one point it's N1, other one it's number 1, and like, why isn't it all the same name? Because it's what I understand.
Why? I want to make sure I'm answering your question.
If
What?
you have it, like, for example, it says NUM1, and then the next function add, it's N1, how come it's not the same?
It could be.
Same.
That's what we're saying. What I'm trying to show you is formal parameters like this do not have to be the same name as actual parameters. You can make them the same. All right? But again, if I'm a professional programmer and I ask you to put in those 10 things and you're calling them good names, first name, last name, middle initial, I'm going to call them in here FN, LN, MI because it's less typing. Now, it's not that big a thing. What you'll like next semester, you might laugh. We're going to actually use a Microsoft product that you're going to like. So if you go, that's not possible. I've never liked the Microsoft product. You will like Visual Studio because it has something that's called code completion for you. It's got IntelliSense. So even if you've got real long names, when you start typing something in, it'll figure out and says, oh, you probably mean this. If you hit the tab key, it'll fill in the rest for you. What's that? Brackets does it too. Okay. That most editors today will do something like that. Notepad++ is such a simplistic editor. It does some, and it's really bad. What it does, seriously, you don't even know it because it's not bad in this language. If I do it in RPG, or not in RPG, in PHP, whenever you type in the beginning of a PHP and you type in this, that's how you start PHP, it automatically puts in this. And it's not let go of my ego. I don't know what the heck it even means, but it puts that in. And it's not like it asks you, it just puts stuff in for you. All right, that's why at least at times, right, using Notepad++ is a pain. All right, anything else on there? I wanted to go over it like this because I thought it would make more sense to do it this way. All right, so I'm going to erase all this because we'll go on. Yeah.
So with the formal functions, so because it's, I guess, how does the program like understand like N1 equals num1?
Okay.
Like first name to be added.
All right, two things. You asked, first of all, don't call them formal functions. They're parameters. Okay, now I just want you to know. That's okay.
Yeah.
But the question is, how does it know? I think this is what you're asking, that N1 is num1.
Right, yeah.
Because what happens when you do this is all the computer cares about, it doesn't give a darn about that 10. What it does is it says that that's the address of where 10 lives. All right, so that's actually what it cares about is the address. And it says, oh, that address is the same as that address. It doesn't matter what you call it. So it's kind of like looking at it this way. So that would be the Williams, and that would be the Williams family type of an idea. It's the same thing, it's just got a different
Right.
name.
Okay.
All right. Like I said, I've said this to people before, and I'm not trying to make too much or not enough of it, but just so you know, it's called a language for a reason. You're learning a new language. All right. So they come in here on page 79, and they're talking in here about actual and formal parameters and passing stuff. That's what I just showed you. All right. You may get more out of it looking at the way they show it in the book. I don't know. But especially if you're having any kind of problem with this, I would strongly encourage you to really read the chapter. Not just do the exercises, but to read the chapter. All right, on page 80, they talk about this. I want you to understand, or hopefully understand this, right here, the stuff that's in blue right here. All right? You already know how to do an input button, or a submit button, but what's new is all of this stuff. This literally says, and this is not a good way to code, just so you know, this is not a good way to code, because I'm putting JavaScript right into my HTML. That's not the way that you're going to code. But when we start, it's okay, all right? But what this says is when you click the submit button, an alert should come up on the screen that says, thanks for your order, we appreciate your business. Does that make sense? That's what happens. On this example here, when you click the submit button, it should bring up a routine that's called show message, whatever that routine is. That's a little bit better because rather than putting the code right in here, that show message could be in a separate JavaScript routine, either somewhere else on your page or in its own JS file. All right. The other thing too, and I don't know why they don't do this, even though this works fine like it is, most of the time when programmers write like this, when you say on click equals show message, right before that double quote, right there, you would put a semicolon in there. You don't have to do it, but most of the time you see developers do that, just so you're aware of it. All right. And this is known as an event handler. The event is the click event. The way that JavaScript does this is before almost every event, they put the word on in front of it. And if you go, that's weird. We already looked at it in Chapter 1. You may or may not remember there was a big table on one of the pages in Chapter 1 that went over most of the events and then the associated names like on click, on submit, etc. All right. This is a little bit different, but the idea is the same. So now what we're telling the user in our code is, okay, find, so that button would have to have an ID that was called submit button. So find the element with an ID of submit button. When you click that element, what we're doing here is we're telling it to associate the show message function with that button click. Like I said, this is gonna seem weird. The good news is they're showing you a hell of a lot in this chapter. And the good news is we're going to start in the ones we do very slowly. All right? And it might seem like what we do in this first example is, wait, it's like, why are we doing something so much simpler than what's in the book? Because the author tries to give you kind of the everything in hyperdrive in one chapter. All right? And then they go into this. I'm not going to talk to this anymore other than to mention right here when they say this add event listener is supported by all modern browsers. But notice when IE changed to IE9, they started to support it. Before IE9, they had their own way of doing things. That's why Microsoft gets such a bad rap, because they've always had to do things their own way. All right. So you're going to end up writing things like this. Okay? And I think this is from part of what's in the exercise in the chapter. It's one thing for you to type the stuff in. You're all smart people. You can all type it in and get it to work. It's another thing to type it in, read what it is you're typing in, so you can understand it and get it to work. All right? Because I'll guarantee you that this stuff is actually considered quite simplistic. Okay? So what we're saying in here is we're creating a new variable that's called E1 or EL. I don't know what it is. Let's say E1. All right? And we're associating it with our submit button. And then we're adding a listener to it, and what a listener means is it's kind of like, imagine that you're sitting there, imagine that you're a parent, and I know some of you in here are parents. All right, so you're a parent and your kid is 16 and it's the first time they're going out alone with the car. All right, so what are you doing? You're sitting by the door, even though it doesn't help any, but you're listening for that car to come back in. All right, well, in much the same way, the program sits there and listens for things to happen. Those things that can happen that it can respond to are called events. So what we're adding in here is what's called an event listener, which says when that particular event, when that element, that submit button, when it's clicked, call this function. Do you notice that function, if you look on the lines that are in kind of mustard yellow, notice how the first one says function paren paren? Everybody see that? That means it's an anonymous function. There is no name given to it. All right? And the good news is, once you learn this and it makes some sense to you, learning jQuery isn't that difficult. Because all jQuery does is it combines this stuff with stuff you already know about CSS. You know, the pound sign for IDs, the dot, etc. And it works with it because all jQuery does is it builds on JavaScript to add super support for CSS selectors. More than anything else, that's what it does. So again, they have you go in there and do all this, and they explain as you do it exactly what's happening in each step. All right, I'm trying to give you the overview. You know, and maybe I've told you this before, maybe I haven't, but I remember this student who came up to me, this was probably a good close to 10 years ago, and she said, you know, I don't even know why I bought a book for this class, because I listen to what you say, and I take very good notes, et cetera, and I'm getting an A. And I said, yeah, but you're not getting everything. I said, did you ever read the book? No. And I looked at it, and the book was on her desk, and you could see that this didn't go up like that. There was, you know, it looked brand new. And I'm like, what are you going to do with it? Well, I'm going to sell it back. So she paid $100 for it. If she's lucky, she'll get a half back. If I'm going to go out and spend 20 grand on a car, and it's a really cool looking car, but I can still get around by having other people give me rides to places, I'm not going to keep that car for a year and then sell it for $10,000. To me, there's a word for that, and the word's stupid. I meant to supplement the stuff that's in here and to pull out what I think is the most important. But there's so much more that we just don't have a chance to get to go through. All right. They have you also go in and take a look at the console for your browser. Now, we looked at this once before. If I come in here, and right here, if I hit, you all see your function keys up at the top of the screen, of the top of your keyboard, I should say. If I hit F12, that's going to bring up either over here or down here. All right. It's in here, since I'm in Chrome, it brings up what are called the Chrome Dev Tools, the Chrome Developer Tools. And one of the things that's in here someplace is console. So I can actually, I wouldn't do it here, but I can actually go in, and isn't it funny? Wow, this is the book, and they got all sorts of errors in here. Yes, they do. All right. But this is a way that you're going to be able to go in and start to debug your program when you have errors. What I'm going to show you today is an even simpler way to debug. So once you learn that, then learning this will be, will be much easier. And there's a later chapter. What is it, like chapter 5? Chapter 4. It's called Debugging and Error Handling. That's all it's on. All right. And if you want this to go away, you just hit F12 again. So they talk about the console. I'm not going to go through it right now because we will go through it in detail when we get into later classes. But you get something that looks like this. What's nice is it gives you good errors. And usually it's very explicit errors that will pretty much tell you where in your code the problem is. All right? And it's funny, I'm not going to lie to you, that I should have used it today, but I was so headstrong that I had, I'm going to figure out this frickin' thing, and I couldn't understand what it was. I had my parenthesis in the wrong place. And I'll show you it later. But the program wasn't giving me any errors, it just wasn't giving me the right output. If I had gone to the console, it probably would have found it for me right away. Well, that was on me. All right, so they talk about returns. I've already showed you the return statement, okay? The next thing is scope. I don't know if I left any of this up here or not, but let's see. If I define variables at the top of my program like this, not inside of a function, but at the top of the program, they're known as global variables. What that means is any function that's in the program can use them. If I define variables in a function, like let's say I defined a variable in this function, okay, if I define a variable in there, it's called a local variable. It's only known within that variable. And I've given you these examples before that when something is up here, when it's global, it's also known as being public. Kind of like a public servant. You know, anybody in government, you're supposed to be able to go and meet with them at any time. All right? Not so much somebody who's private. You know, you can't just walk into their house and say, hey, what's for dinner? Type of an idea. All right? That's scope. So a global variable is declared outside of any function and available to every part of the code. Local is declared inside of a function and typically is only available within that function. And they give you some examples. All right? So this is what you're going to end up writing in here. Now, the question sometimes comes up is, okay, so I've got these global variables here. Notice I even said global variables. Don't need that. Right here. What if I come in here and I create another variable right here that's called num, and I set it equal to 27. I just made that up. This num variable right here is not the same as this one. So I can inside of a function, I can create a variable that has the same name as a global variable. Did you hear that? They're two different variables. This variable now that you see here that says var num equal 27, that's called, it shadows the other variable. So you don't even know that this one exists right now. Can you still get to it? It depends on the language you're using. All right? And we're going to cover all that stuff. Like I said, my goal here is not to confuse you that much. I probably already am, at least with some of you anyway, but that's not the goal. Now here's some of the built-in JavaScript functions. We've looked at these a little bit, these two. The parse float and the parse int, we've looked at those a little bit. You're going to see them again today. Not too long, we're going to get into this one, which checks if something is numeric or not. All right? The only thing I will tell you is be real leery of that function right there that's called eval. All right? In fact, I want to see if it's still out here. There used to be a really good document. I don't see it anymore. Well, maybe that is it still. Eval is evil. It's recommended that you not use that particular, it's because it's so powerful and it's so easy to misuse it. Okay? And what you can do with the eval function is you can do things that you shouldn't be allowed to do in a programming language. All right? Because eval lets you do almost anything. So just be real leery. That's all I'm telling you. Some of the other stuff, encoding and decoding, all right, that would become more important. That, for instance, if I decide that I'm gonna call stuff and I'm gonna pass it, and when I pass it, you can see it all up here. All right, but I do want to set it up so that I can pass credit card numbers and passwords and stuff. Then I can encode it, which is like encrypting it, all right, and decode it. Okay, we'll talk about some of that stuff as we go on in here. I wouldn't worry about it right now. All right. So here, notice this says, let's set up a social security number and make it 123-45-6789. Then we run this on it. There's good news and bad news. The good news is that's going to actually be true. The bad news is the way that this works is it thinks your social security number, and actually that may or may not work. It actually thinks it's 123. Literally, if I put this in here, if I put social security number, if I leave off those minus signs, anybody guess what happens? So let's say let's say I remove the double quotes and I put it in as 123-45-6789. Anybody want to guess what that does? It does subtraction. So it says take 123, subtract 45 from it, which will give me about 78, and subtract from that negative, so it'll give me negative 6,700 something. That's why you put that in there. But you put the double quotes in, because then it says, oh, it's a string. But since it's a string, that is not a number, may or may not pass. And you'll see that as we go on in here. All right. Data types, this is what a nice thing. We'll take a break in about 2 minutes. But this is kind of a nice thing here on page 91, bottom of the page. There's only 5 types of data in this language. Okay? Why should you care? Because C# that you'll go through next semester probably has about 30. All right? Much easier to memorize 5. Not that you're ever going to have to memorize 30. You won't. But it handles all numbers the same, whether they're positive or negative, whether they have a decimal or they don't have a decimal. Doesn't care. All right? They have Boolean, which is just true and false. Strings, you already know these can be either in double quotes or single quotes. All right? And undefined and null. Now I want to try to very quickly explain this to you, and this may make no sense whatsoever, but I just want to show you this. If I did this, if all I wrote here was var num1, all right? So that's all I did was to write var num1, and then I said alert, the value of num1 is, anybody want to guess what that would print, this line right here in blue? Anyone want to guess? What's that? Yes, it would print the value of num1 is undefined because you haven't given it a value yet. Okay? On the other hand, let's go back and change it to the way it was, which was like this. All right? Now, if I decide I don't want those to have values anymore, you can't sit there and say num1 equals undefined. I think if you try doing that, you're going to get an error. I may or may not be right on that. But you can do this. So null is the absence of any value. Undefined means it hasn't been given a value yet. And if it still confuses you, look at it this way. Let's say that I invent a new word. Okay? And this stuff does happen, especially with computers and stuff. In fact, yesterday, Charles was reading something. We all stayed here till 7 last night because there was an open house here at Wentzville, and people were coming and going. And Charles asked, he said, do any of you know what this acronym means? And I don't remember even what it was. It was like ALP or something like that. And none of us knew. So we just looked it up right away, okay? But the point is, up until when somebody created that acronym, until it was accepted by other people, it was undefined. All right? And later, if somebody decides, you know what, I don't even know if we're going to use that anymore. We'll keep the acronym, but we don't want it to be equal to anything. That's null. So that's the difference between null and undefined. But again, those are the only different 5 types of data. Okay? There is a really good example right here that shows it. They show you what undefined is. It says write out state text. You haven't even defined it yet. There really should be vars in here. Oh, there you go. Var state text. Then you write it out, and it gives you undefined. Then you set it, and you write it out again, and it's got a value. Then you set it to null, and you write it out. This is a really good example on page 92 in the book. All right? Last thing, and we are taking a break, on the bottom of this page and going on to the top of the next page. So this is the top of page 93. JavaScript is what's called a loosely typed programming language. In English, what that means is you put the word var in and you give it a name, but you don't give it a type. You don't tell it that it's a number variable. You don't tell it that it's a string, etc. You don't do that, like you'll do next semester when you create variables in C# or next year when you create variables in Java. So JavaScript is known as a loosely typed language, which means you can develop sloppy patterns. The other languages are called strongly typed. So if you need more on that, you can look at what's in the book there on the top of page 93. All right? All right, so let's take a break. It's 8:58. Let's come back. Let's make it 9:15. We'll finish, hopefully by 10 o'clock, we'll finish the chapter. Yeah, there's still a lot to go. But a lot of it are the exercises, so we're going to do that. Then after that, I'm gonna spend about 15 minutes with you, and we're gonna quickly do the test review, then we're gonna look at some code. All right, so I'm sorry if it's taken a little bit longer today, but to me, you're starting to make the transition into programmers. It's important that you have some time doing this. All right, so 9:15, please.